The diplomatic transport ship Harmony shuddered as another blast of frozen air hit its hull. David Rivers pressed his face against the small window and watched the white storm swirl outside. Ice crystals scraped against the metal like tiny claws. He had seen bad weather before, but nothing like this. "How much longer until we land?" asked War Commander Salth from across the cabin. The Drakmari leader was almost 7 feet tall, covered in dark green scales that looked like armor. His yellow eyes never blinked when he spoke. "Maybe 20 minutes, David said. "The pilot says the storm is getting worse, though." Salth made a low growling sound. "Drakmari do not fear storms." David nodded but kept his worry to himself. The 14 Drakmari warriors sitting in the transport cabin looked strong and fierce. Their claws could cut through steel and their scales could stop bullets. But David knew something they might not understand. Cold was different from other enemies. Cold didn't care how strong you were. The ship lurched suddenly to the left. David grabbed his seat as alarms started beeping. Through the small door to the cockpit, he could see the pilot fighting with the controls. Red lights flashed everywhere. "Engine failure," the pilot shouted back to them. "We're going down." David felt his stomach drop as the ship started falling. Outside the window, the white storm became a blur. The Drakmari warriors stayed calm, but their claws extended slightly from their fingers. Even they knew this was bad. The crash happened fast. One moment they were falling, and the next moment David was lying on the floor with his ears ringing. Smoke filled the cabin and cold air rushed in through a crack in the wall. The alarms had stopped, but that wasn't good news. David pushed himself up and looked around. Most of the Drakmari were getting to their feet, but 3 of them weren't moving. War Commander Salth had blood on his forehead, but his eyes were still sharp. "Status report," Salth ordered his warriors. "Hull breach in Section 3, said one warrior. "Environmental systems offline." 3 warriors unconscious but breathing, reported another. David made his way to the cockpit. The pilot was slumped over the controls, not breathing. Through the broken windscreen, he could see nothing but swirling snow. The temperature gauge showed -40 degrees outside, and it was dropping fast inside the ship too. "We need to get out of here," David called back to the Drakmari. "The hull won't hold much longer." Salth walked over to him, moving more slowly than usual. "Where can we go?" "This planet is frozen wasteland." David checked his emergency scanner. The device was cracked but still working. "There might be thermal activity about half a mile from here. Underground heat sources. Half a mile in this storm will kill us," said one of the warriors. David looked at the Drakmari around him. They were already moving more slowly than normal. Their breath came out in white clouds, and their usually bright scales looked dull. He remembered reading about their species in the diplomatic files. Drakmari were cold-blooded like the ancient reptiles of Earth. Cold made them weak. "How long before the cold affects you badly?" David asked Salth quietly. The war commander's pride made him hesitate, but another gust of frozen air through the hull breach decided for him. "Perhaps 1 hour before we cannot fight. 2 hours before we cannot move. 3 hours." He didn't finish the sentence. David felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. 14 lives depended on him now. These weren't just any lives either. These were Drakmari dragon warriors, the most respected fighters in the galaxy. If they died because of human incompetence in planning this mission, it could destroy relations between their species forever. The emergency scanner beeped. David looked at the display and saw something that made his heart jump. "The thermal sources aren't just underground," he said. "They're connected to water. Hot springs. Water will not help us," Salth said through chattering teeth. "It will if I can get you there." David started gathering emergency supplies from the ship's lockers. "I used to swim competitively. Won medals for it." "The hot springs are connected by underground water passages." One of the Drakmari warriors laughed, but it sounded weak. "Soft skin thinks he can swim in freezing water." David pulled on an emergency thermal suit and checked the underwater breathing gear. "Humans evolved near water. Our bodies can handle cold better than most species, at least for short periods. I can make it through the underwater passages and find a way to get you all to the warm areas." Salth studied David's face. "You would risk your life for warriors you barely know? That's what we're here for, isn't it? Building trust between our people." The hull breach grew larger with a loud crack, letting in more freezing air. Several of the Drakmari were now sitting down, their movements becoming sluggish. The 3 unconscious warriors hadn't woken up yet. David sealed his thermal suit and activated the heating elements. "I need to move fast." Can your warriors carry the unconscious ones? For now, Salth said. But not for long. David opened the emergency hatch and immediately felt the full force of the blizzard. Snow stung his face like needles and the wind tried to knock him down, but his thermal suit held, and his human body adapted quickly to the extreme cold. Leading the group of Drakmari through the storm was like guiding giants through a white maze. The warriors helped each other, but David could see them getting weaker with each step. Their proud military formation broke down as they struggled against the wind and cold. When they reached the area where his scanner showed thermal activity, David found what he was looking for. A hole in the ice led down to dark water that wasn't frozen. Steam rose from the surface, which meant it was warm below. The passages lead to caverns with hot springs, David explained to Salth. But I'll have to take you through one at a time. The underwater route is too narrow for more than one person. Drakmari do not swim, Salth admitted quietly. You don't have to swim. Just hold on to me and don't panic. David checked his breathing gear one more time. I'll take the unconscious ones first, then the weakest. Before anyone could argue, David grabbed the first unconscious warrior and dove into the steaming water. The contrast between the freezing air and the warm water was shocking, but his body adjusted quickly, swimming through the narrow underwater tunnel while carrying a 7-foot reptilian warrior, tested every skill he had learned in years of competitive swimming. The tunnel was longer than he expected, but David's lungs held out. When he finally surfaced in the cavern beyond, warm air touched his face like a blessing. The space was large enough for all the warriors, and several hot springs bubbled up from the rock floor. David pulled the unconscious warrior onto the rocky shore and checked his breathing. Still alive, but barely. He dove back into the tunnel to get the others. 3 more trips through the freezing water and narrow passage brought the remaining unconscious warriors to safety. By then, David's thermal suit was failing, and his own body temperature was dropping dangerously low. But when he surfaced for the 4th time, ready to guide the conscious warriors through, he found Salth waiting at the water's edge with determination in his yellow eyes. A Dragon War commander goes last, Salth said firmly. David nodded and began the most important rescue mission of his life. The first thing David noticed when all 14 Drakmari warriors were finally in the warm cavern was that they weren't getting better fast enough. Yes, the hot springs provided heat, but the dragon warriors were still moving like they were half asleep. Their breathing was shallow and their scales had lost their normal shine. This is not sufficient, War Commander Salth admitted as he sat heavily on the rocky ground near the largest spring. The warmth helps, but our kind needs more direct heat to recover from such extreme cold. David knelt beside one of the unconscious warriors and felt the creature's forehead. The scales were still ice cold despite being in the heated cavern for over an hour. How much warmer do you need to be? Body temperature must return to normal range, explained a warrior named Drex. He was the smallest of the group, but his knowledge of Drakmari biology was clearly extensive. We are like the cold-blood creatures of your Earth. Without proper internal heat, our organs will shut down slowly. David looked around the cavern. The hot springs were as warm as they were going to get, and there was no way to make them hotter. No fire materials, no technology that survived the crash. Just stone, water, and 14 dying warriors who had trusted him to save them. What if the heat came from another source? David asked. Drex's yellow eyes focused on him with difficulty. What do you mean, human David? David was already removing his thermal suit. The cavern air was warm, but not warm enough to be comfortable without protective gear. Humans maintain constant internal body temperature. We're warm-blooded. My body heat might help. The conscious Drakmari warriors stared at him. In their culture, physical contact between non-family members was rare and significant. War Commander Salth made a sound that might have been surprise. You would share body warmth with dragon warriors? If it keeps you alive, yes. David approached the most critically cold warrior first. The unconscious Drakmari was barely breathing, his large frame curled up despite the cavern's warmth. Without hesitation, David lay down next to the warrior and wrapped his arms around the creature's torso. The contact was shocking. The Drakmari's body felt like embracing a refrigerator, so cold that David's skin almost stuck to the scales. But David held on, letting his human body heat flow into the dying warrior. This is not proper, one of the warriors said weakly. Survival is proper, Salth said firmly. Continue, human David. David stayed pressed against the first warrior for 20 minutes until he felt the Drakmari's body temperature start to rise slightly. Then he moved to the second unconscious warrior and repeated the process. His own body was working hard to maintain its temperature while heating two large reptilian bodies. But his human physiology was designed for this kind of endurance challenge. By the third warrior, David was shivering himself, but he could see the treatment was working. The first warrior he had warmed was breathing more normally, and his scales were starting to regain some of their color. "I need to rotate," David said through chattering teeth. "Warm each of you for a period, then move to the next, then come back. Like a cycle." "This will exhaust you," Drex observed. "Maybe, but it will keep you alive." David established a pattern. 20 minutes with each of the most critical warriors, then a brief rest in the hottest spring, then back to the rotation. His human body was doing what it did best, maintaining stable internal temperature even under extreme stress. As the hours passed, something remarkable happened. The Drakmari warriors who were conscious began to help with the process. They couldn't provide body heat like David could, but they could move the unconscious ones closer to the springs, adjust positions to help David reach them better, and make sure David himself didn't collapse from exhaustion. War Commander Salt was the most helpful of all. Despite his own weakness from the cold, he stayed close to David throughout the process. When David's shivering became too violent, Salt would help guide him to the warm water for recovery. When David's energy flagged, Salt would encourage him to continue. "Why do you do this?" Salt asked during one of David's brief rest periods. "Your mission was diplomacy, not martyrdom." David floated in the hot spring, trying to restore his core temperature before the next rotation. "Where I come from, we have a saying, leave no one behind. It doesn't matter if they're human or Drakmari or anything else. If someone needs help and you can give it, you give it, even if it costs your own life. Especially then." Salt was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke in his own language, a series of growls and clicks that David didn't understand. But the other conscious warriors responded with what sounded like agreement. "What did you say?" David asked. "I declared you Keth Valdris. It means shield brother in our tongue, one who uses his own body as protection for warriors in battle." David pulled himself out of the spring and moved toward the next warrior who needed warming. "I'm not a warrior. You are now." The process continued through the night. David's human body pushed beyond what should have been possible, sharing its warmth with creatures 3 times his size. His skin became raw from contact with rough scales. His muscles ached from hours of maintaining contact with heavy bodies, and his core temperature dropped to dangerous levels multiple times. But it worked. One by one, the unconscious Drakmari warriors began to wake up. Their breathing deepened, their scales regained their natural color, and their body heat started to return to normal levels. When the last warrior opened his eyes and looked around the cavern with clear focus, David finally allowed himself to collapse. He had been awake for over 30 hours, had swum through freezing water multiple times, and had used his own body heat to save 14 lives. Salt knelt beside David as he lay exhausted on the cavern floor. The war commander's own recovery was remarkable now that his body temperature was normal. "Human David," Salt said formally, "by the ancient laws of the Drakmari people, you have earned the highest honor we can give. You have been our shield when we had no other protection." David managed a weak smile. "Just glad everyone made it." "Not everyone," Salt corrected. "You have sacrificed much of yourself. Look." David raised his hands and saw that his fingers were white with frostbite. His feet were numb, and he could see patches of damaged skin on his arms where prolonged contact with ice-cold scales had frozen his flesh. "The medics will treat this when rescue comes," Salt assured him, "but the scars will remain. You will carry marks of this day forever." "Worth it," David said simply. Salt reached into a pouch on his belt and pulled out a small, sharp knife. Before David could ask what he was doing, the war commander used the blade to carefully remove one of his own scales from his shoulder. The golden-green scale was as large as David's palm. "This is for you, shield brother, so all will know what you have done." Around the cavern, 13 other warriors were doing the same thing, each removing a scale to present to David. Soon he was surrounded by golden-green tokens of the highest honor in Drakmari culture. David accepted the scales with hands that shook from exhaustion and cold damage. "Thank you," No, said Salt firmly. Thank you, Shield Brother David Rivers. The Drakmari people will remember this forever. As if summoned by those words, a distant sound echoed through the cavern. Rescue ships, their engines growing louder as they approached through the clearing storm. David closed his eyes and smiled. Everyone was going home. 3 days after the rescue, David woke up in a medical bay that was definitely not human-built. The ceiling was too high, the walls were decorated with strange symbols, and everything had a golden tint that reminded him of the Drakmari scales he had received in the cavern. You are awake, Shield Brother. David turned his head to see War Commander Salt sitting beside his bed. The Drakmari leader looked completely recovered from their ordeal, his scales bright and his eyes alert. Where are we? David asked. His voice came out rough and dry. Drakmari Medical Station in the Frostholm system. Our doctors have been treating your frostbite injuries. Salt gestured to David's bandaged hands. You will heal, but there will be permanent damage to some fingers. David flexed his hands experimentally. They hurt, but they worked. Small price to pay. Not to us, Salt said seriously. David Rivers, what you did in that cavern has created what your people might call a situation. What kind of situation? Salt activated a holographic display that showed news feeds from across the galaxy. David could see his own face on many of the screens, along with images of the Drakmari warriors he had saved. The biorecorder in my armor captured everything, Salt explained. Every moment of your sacrifice, every time you used your own body to warm dying warriors, every hour you spent saving lives at the cost of your own health. David watched footage of himself wrapped around unconscious Drakmari warriors, sharing his body heat to keep them alive. He looked smaller and more fragile than he remembered feeling at the time. The High Council of our people has been debating for 2 days, Salt continued. Some call you the greatest hero in Drakmari history. Others struggle with the implications. What implications? That 14 dragon warriors owed their lives to a single human. That our strongest fighters were saved by someone our culture would traditionally consider weak. Salt's expression was thoughtful. It challenges many of our assumptions about strength and weakness. The medical bay door opened and a human woman in a diplomatic uniform entered. She looked tired and stressed. David, thank goodness you're awake. I'm Ambassador Kelly Wong, human representative to the Drakmari system. We need to talk. David sat up in his bed, ignoring the protest from his sore muscles. What's wrong? Everything, Wong said bluntly. Your rescue has become the biggest news story in 3 sectors, but it's also created a problem we didn't expect. She activated her own holographic display, showing a different set of news feeds. These showed aquatic creatures with blue-green skin and large dark eyes. They moved through what looked like underwater cities. The Aguacate Collective has been monitoring Drakmari communications, Wong explained. They intercepted the footage from Salt's biorecorder. Who are the Aguacate? David asked. Aggressive aquatic species from the outer rim, Salt answered, his voice filled with distaste. They have been expanding their territory for years, conquering water worlds and enslaving other species. We have been their primary obstacle. Wong nodded grimly. The Aguacate leadership sees your rescue as a sign of Drakmari weakness. If mighty dragon warriors need humans to save them, they reason, then the Drakmari are not as strong as everyone believes. David felt a chill that had nothing to do with his recent frostbite injuries. They're going to attack. They're already moving, Wong confirmed. Our deep space monitors detected a massive Aguacate fleet mobilizing 2 days ago. 102 warships all heading for Drakmari space. Salt stood up, his warrior instincts taking over. How long until they arrive? 6 hours, maybe less. David swung his legs over the side of the medical bed, ignoring the pain in his feet. I need to get back to human space. If the Drakmari are going to be attacked because of something I did, no, Salt interrupted firmly. You will not run from this, Shield Brother. The Aguacate use your actions as excuse, but they would have found another reason eventually. This is not your fault, but it is connected to me, David said. Maybe I can help solve it. Ambassador Wong looked skeptical. How? You're a rescue specialist, not a military strategist, and you're injured. I'm the person who saved 14 Drakmari warriors by using human traits that other species thought were weaknesses, David replied. Maybe that perspective is useful. Salt's yellow eyes gleamed with interest. What are you thinking, Shield Brother? David stood up slowly, testing his balance. I'm thinking the Aguacate made the same mistake everyone makes about humans. They see the rescue footage and think it shows human and Drakmari weakness. They don't understand what it actually shows, which is adaptation, cooperation, the willingness to sacrifice for others. David looked at the news feed showing the approaching Aguacate fleet. All the things that make humans dangerous in ways that most warrior cultures don't recognize. Wong was shaking her head. David, you can't seriously be thinking of getting involved in an interstellar military conflict. You're not qualified for that. Maybe not, David agreed, but I am qualified to swim, to survive in extreme conditions, and to do whatever it takes to keep people alive. If that's what this situation needs, then I'm the right person for the job. Salth moved to stand beside David, showing his support. The High Council would listen to the Shield brother who saved 14 dragon warriors. Your words carry weight now. What words? David asked. What would I say? The truth, Salth replied. That strength comes in many forms. That cooperation between species creates power that neither could achieve alone. That the Aguacate are making the same mistake our own people made when they underestimated you. David looked at the displays showing both the celebrating Drakmari and the advancing Aguacate fleet. A plan was forming in his mind, born from the same instincts that had driven him to save lives in a frozen cavern. Can you get me a communication link to both fleets? He asked Wong. That's not how diplomacy works, David. There are protocols, procedures. Ambassador, Salth interrupted politely but firmly. The Shield brother has earned the right to speak for Drakmari interests. If he wishes to address our enemies, we will provide the means. Wong looked between David and Salth, clearly recognizing that she was witnessing something unprecedented. A human who had gained the full respect and support of the galaxy's most prideful warrior culture. Fine, she said finally, but whatever you're planning to say, it better be good. Because in 6 hours, we're going to have the largest aquatic invasion fleet in the galaxy arriving on our doorstep. David nodded, his mind already working on what would later be called the Deep Current speech. He had saved 14 warriors by refusing to let cold defeat them. Now he had to save 2 entire species by refusing to let fear and misunderstanding lead to unnecessary war. Get me that communication link, he said. It's time to show the Aguacate what they're really dealing with. Salth placed a scaled hand on David's shoulder. What they are dealing with is a shield brother of the Drakmari. That alone should give them pause. Let's hope so, David replied, looking out at the stars where enemy ships were approaching fast. Because we're about to find out if the same traits that work in a frozen cavern can prevent a galactic war. David had expected the Drakmari ceremony to be simple, maybe just a few words and a handshake. He was wrong about that, just like he had been wrong about many things involving the dragon warriors. The Hall of Deep Honor was carved into living rock and filled with thousands of Drakmari. Their scales caught the light from floating crystal formations, making the entire space shimmer like the inside of a jewel. David stood in the center wearing formal human diplomatic clothing that felt strange after days in medical robes. Elder Vorth, the oldest Drakmari on their High Council, approached David carrying an ornate box. Human David Rivers, you will now receive the marks of Valdris Keth, shield brother to all Drakmari people. This honor has never been given to an off-worlder. I'm ready, David said, though he wasn't sure what he was ready for. The ceremony that followed was unlike anything in human culture. Each of the 14 warriors he had saved came forward and placed one of their own scales into a special device that somehow bonded the scale to David's spine through advanced medical technology. The process didn't hurt, but David could feel each scale as it became part of him. When the last scale was in place, David felt different. Not just because of the physical additions, but because of what they represented. He was now connected to the Drakmari in a way that went beyond friendship or alliance. You are now our shield brother, Elder Vorth announced to the assembled crowd. Your courage in the frozen place has earned you a place in our history that will never be forgotten. The celebration was interrupted by urgent alarms. War Commander Salth stepped forward with news that made David's new scales feel suddenly heavy. The Aguacate fleet has been detected at the edge of our system. 102 ships, just as our intelligence predicted. They will arrive within 4 hours. Elder Vorth's expression hardened. Then we will meet them in battle as we always have. With respect, Elder, David said. Maybe there's another way. The hall fell silent. Thousands of Drakmari eyes focused on the human who had just been given their highest honor. You wish to speak, shield brother? Elder Vorth asked. I want to try talking to them first. Both fleets. Before anyone starts shooting. Murmurs spread through the hall. Some sounded approving, others skeptical. War Commander Salth stepped beside David. What would you say to creatures who see your rescue of dragon warriors as proof of our weakness? David thought about the footage he had seen of himself in the cavern, wrapped around dying Drakmari warriors. I'd tell them the truth about what really happened. That it wasn't weakness that saved your people. It was something much more dangerous than that, which is cooperation, adaptation, the willingness to do whatever it takes to protect others. David looked around the hall at the assembled Drakmari. Every species in the galaxy thinks they know what strength looks like. Big muscles, sharp claws, powerful weapons. But humans survived and spread across the galaxy, not because we were the strongest, but because we were the most persistent and adaptable. Elder Vorth considered this. You believe the Aguacate can be made to understand this? I believe they should have the chance to understand it before we start a war that might not be necessary. The Elder looked to Salth, who nodded his support. Very well, Shield Brother. You may address both fleets, but if your words fail, we will be ready to fight. 2 hours later, David found himself in the communication center of the Drakmari flagship. The setup allowed him to broadcast simultaneously to the Drakmari fleet and the approaching Aguacate forces. Ambassador Wong stood nearby, looking nervous but supportive. Remember, Wong said quietly, you're not just representing humanity here. You're speaking for an alliance that could shape the future of this entire sector. David nodded and activated the communication system. On the main screen, he could see split images of both fleets. The Drakmari ships looked like flying fortresses, all angles and armor. The Aguacate vessels were more organic, flowing like sea creatures through space. This is David Rivers, Shield Brother to the Drakmari people, and representative of the Human Diplomatic Corps. He began. I'm speaking to both fleets because I think there's been a misunderstanding about what happened on the ice planet Frostholm. He paused, seeing reactions on both sides. The Drakmari watched with respectful attention. The Aguacate appeared to be listening, but their expressions were harder to read. 3 days ago, 14 Drakmari warriors were dying from extreme cold after our ship crashed. I used my body heat to keep them alive until rescue arrived. Some of you have seen the footage and decided this shows weakness on both sides, that a human had to save mighty dragon warriors, and that the warriors needed saving at all. David leaned closer to the camera. But that's not what the footage actually shows. What it shows is two species finding a way to work together when everything seemed hopeless. It shows adaptation, cooperation, and the refusal to give up when lives are at stake. On the screen, he could see Admiral Reef of the Aguacate fleet, a large amphibious creature with dark blue skin and intelligent eyes. The Admiral was listening intently. The Drakmari didn't become weaker because they accepted help, David continued. They became stronger because they learned that strength comes in many forms. And humans didn't become heroes because we're naturally superior. We became effective because we're willing to adapt and sacrifice for others. Admiral Reef's voice came through the communication system, distorted by the translation equipment. Soft words, human. But we have seen the footage. Your lizard allies required saving by a species known for weakness. No, David said firmly. You've seen footage of a species known for persistence, refusing to let anyone die when they could be saved. You've seen evidence that cooperation between different types of creatures creates power that neither could achieve alone. Pretty philosophy, Admiral Reef replied. But the Drakmari have been our enemies for generations. This changes nothing. David felt the weight of the scales on his back and drew strength from their meaning. Then you're making the same mistake everyone makes about humans and our allies. You're confusing kindness with weakness, cooperation with surrender. He stood up, his voice growing stronger. The Drakmari didn't need a human to save them because they were weak. They needed a human because humans are good at surviving in hostile environments, and were willing to risk everything to help others. Those aren't signs of weakness, Admiral. Those are the traits that make humans and their allies the most dangerous forces in the galaxy. The communication channel fell silent. David could see both fleets hanging in space, waiting to see what would happen next. You want to test that theory? David asked quietly. Then come ahead, Admiral Reef. But remember that you're not just fighting the Drakmari anymore. You're fighting an alliance that includes humans. And humans don't give up, don't surrender, and don't let their friends die. Admiral Reef's image leaned forward on the screen. Bold words from a single soft skin. Not just from me, David replied. From every human in the galaxy, and every species that chooses cooperation over conquest. The silence stretched for long moments. Then Admiral Reef spoke again, his tone thoughtful. Perhaps, human David Rivers, we should meet in person before blood is spilled. I am curious about this philosophy of yours. David smiled. I was hoping you'd say that, Admiral. The meeting between the fleets was supposed to happen on neutral ground, but space combat rarely goes according to diplomatic plans. David was preparing for the face-to-face discussion with Admiral Reef when the shooting started. Enemy ships. Breaking formation, War Commander Salth shouted from the bridge of the Drakmari flagship. They're attacking. David rushed to the tactical display and saw what was happening. Most of the Aguacate fleet was holding position as agreed, but a group of 12 ships had broken away and opened fire on the Drakmari vessels. Admiral Reef, David called over the communication system. Control your ships. The Admiral's voice came back strained and angry. These are not my orders. Commander Surge has taken some ships and attacked without authorization. David watched the tactical display as the battle unfolded. The Aguacate, ships that were attacking, moved like predators, fast and aggressive. Their bioelectric weapons sent blue lightning across space, and where the energy hit Drakmari's shields, the defensive systems failed quickly. Surge believes diplomacy is weakness, Admiral Reef explained over the communication channel. He has convinced some captains that your offer of peace is a trick. War Commander Salth's ship shuddered as enemy fire struck the hull. Shield, brother. We must respond to this attack. David saw the situation spiraling out of control. If the Drakmari fleet engaged the attacking Aguacate ships, Admiral Reef would be forced to join the battle to protect his own people. The meeting would become a full war, exactly what they were trying to prevent. There has to be another way, David said, studying the tactical display. Then he saw it. Salth, where is Commander Surge's ship? The large biocruiser at the center of the attacking formation. Why? David was already moving toward the emergency equipment lockers. Because if we remove him from the equation, the other ships might stop fighting. David, what are you planning? Ambassador Wong asked with concern in her voice. Something stupid, probably. David pulled on an emergency spacesuit and checked the life support systems. But if it works, we stop a war. Salth realized what David was thinking. You cannot assault an enemy warship by yourself, Shield brother. That is not a rescue mission. That is suicide. Maybe, David agreed, sealing his helmet. But someone has to try, and I'm the only one both sides might listen to. The plan David proposed was indeed close to suicide. He would take a small emergency pod, approach Commander Surge's ship during the battle, and somehow get aboard to confront the Rouge Aguacate commander directly. The enemy ship's hull is designed for underwater combat, Salth explained as they prepared the pod. It will be filled with oxygenated water, not air. You cannot survive in that environment. Actually, I can, David said, checking his modified breathing gear. Humans can hold their breath for long periods if we train for it, and I've been swimming my whole life. War Commander Salth shook his head. This is madness, even for a shield brother. This is what humans do, David replied. We adapt. The Q. Emergency pod launched during the heaviest part of the fighting. David piloted the small craft through energy beams and debris, using the chaos of battle as cover. The Aguacate biocruiser was huge, shaped like a massive sea creature with organic curves and flowing fins. Getting inside required finding a docking port that would accept his small pod. David located what looked like a maintenance entrance and managed to connect his craft to the ship's hull. The scary part came next. When David opened the pod's hatch, he found himself facing a chamber filled with water instead of air. The liquid was warm and had a blue-green tint, and David could see bioluminescent patterns moving through it like living circuits. David activated his breathing gear, sealed his spacesuit properly, and swam into the alien ship. Moving through the water-filled corridors was like swimming through an alien ocean. The walls pulsed with organic life, and strange creatures that might have been part of the ship's biological systems moved past him. David's human swimming abilities were put to the test as he navigated the complex layout. Following the sounds of command voices, David eventually found what had to be the bridge. It was a large spherical chamber filled with the same oxygenated water, where several Aguacate officers floated at different levels around control stations. Commander Surge was easy to identify. He was larger than the others, with darker blue skin and more aggressive movements. When David swam into the bridge chamber, every Aguacate present turned to stare at the unexpected human visitor. "What is this?" Surge demanded, his voice carrying clearly through the water. "How did a land dweller get aboard my ship?" David removed his breathing mask, trusting his human lung capacity to keep him alive long enough for what he needed to say. "Commander Surge, I'm David Rivers, the human from the diplomatic mission. I came to talk." "You came to die," Surge replied, his claws extending from his hands. "Soft-skinned creatures do not belong in the deep water." "Maybe not," David agreed, swimming closer despite the obvious threat. "But humans are good at surviving in places where we don't belong." The conversation that followed took place entirely underwater, with David holding his breath while explaining the same message he had broadcast to the fleets. But this time, he had to prove his words with actions. When Surge attacked, David was ready. The Aguacate commander was faster and stronger in the water, but David had spent his entire life swimming. He used his human flexibility and endurance to avoid Surge's claws while staying close enough to keep talking. "This is what I meant about cooperation," David said during a brief pause in the fighting. "I'm not trying to defeat you, Commander. I'm trying to show you that different abilities can work together. You speak of cooperation while invading my ship. I speak of cooperation while risking my life to prevent a war that doesn't need to happen." The fight continued for several minutes, with David using every swimming technique he knew to stay alive in the water-filled chamber. The other Aguacate officers watched in amazement as the human continued to function effectively in an environment that should have killed him quickly. Finally, David saw his opportunity. When Surge lunged forward for what he intended to be a finishing strike, David didn't dodge. Instead, he grabbed the Aguacate commander and used his own momentum to slam both of them into a support beam that was collapsing due to battle damage. The beam fell toward them, heavy enough to crush both David and Surge. David could have swum away and let the Aguacate commander be killed. Instead, he used his own body to shield Surge from the falling debris, taking the impact himself. The blow knocked David unconscious, but it also saved Surge's life. When David woke up, he was still underwater but breathing through emergency equipment that the Aguacate crew had provided. Commander Surge floated nearby, his expression completely changed. "Why?" Surge asked simply. "Because that's what Shield brothers do," David answered. "We protect others even when they're trying to kill us." Surge looked around at his crew, then back at David. "I have seen many displays of strength in battle, human, but I have never seen someone use their own body to protect an enemy." "That's the difference between strength and power," David said. "Strength is about what you can do. Power is about what you choose to do." Commander Surge was quiet for a long moment. Then he activated his ship's communication system. "All Aguacate vessels, this is Commander Surge. Cease fire immediately. Return to formation." The battle stopped as suddenly as it had started. "I think," Surge said to David, "Admiral Reef was right to listen to your words, human shield brother. Perhaps it is time for the Aguacate to learn about this cooperation you speak of." David smiled, still breathing underwater with alien equipment in an impossible situation. "I was hoping you'd say that, Commander." 6 months after the battle that almost happened, David stood on the shore of New Harmony, watching something that would have been impossible to imagine when he first crashed on the ice planet. Drakmari younglings were teaching Aguacate children how to swim in the shallow areas, while human kids showed both species how to build sandcastles on the beach. The colony world was a miracle of cooperation. It had vast oceans that the Aguacate loved, warm climates that kept the Drakmari comfortable, and enough land area for human settlements. More importantly, it had become proof that 3 very different species could not just coexist, but thrive together. "The water temperature sensors are working perfectly," reported Dr. Sarah Kim, the human marine biologist who had helped design the colony's environmental systems. "The Aguacate biotechnology is keeping the ocean areas at optimal conditions. while the Drakmari thermal generators maintain perfect temperatures for all three species. David nodded, watching a group of mixed-species children splash in the waves. Hard to believe this all started with a crash landing and some body heat. Not just body heat, said War Commander Salth, approaching along the beach. The Drakmari leader now wore lighter armor adapted for the water world, and his scales had taken on a slightly blue tint from regular swimming. It started with a human who refused to let anyone die when he could save them. Admiral Reef emerged from the deeper water, his amphibious form perfectly suited for moving between sea and land, and continued with the same human refusing to let anyone kill when peace was possible. David looked at his two friends, still amazed by how much had changed. The scales on his back had adapted to the water environment, allowing him to stay submerged longer than any unmodified human. The Aguacate had given him bioluminescent markings that helped him navigate in deep water. His body had become a living symbol of interspecies cooperation. The Council of Three Worlds wants a formal report on the colony's progress. Admiral Reef continued. They are considering approving 12 more mixed colonies based on our success here. 12 more chances for different species to learn from each other, Salth added. The ripple effects of what we have built here are spreading across the galaxy. David waded into the warm water, feeling equally comfortable on land or in the sea. Speaking of ripple effects, how are the diplomatic talks going with the other species? Better than expected, Reef replied. The Crystalline Confederacy wants to learn about our cooperation model. Even the Machine Collective has expressed interest in cultural exchange programs. Fear spreads quickly through the galaxy, Salth observed. But so does hope, when it is genuine. David dove beneath the surface, his modified physiology allowing him to breathe underwater while still maintaining his human lung capacity. Around him, he could see the underwater city that the Aguacate had built, its bioluminescent towers growing up from the ocean floor like living coral reefs. When he surfaced, he found Commander Surge waiting with news. The former aggressive officer had become one of the colony's most dedicated peacekeepers. Human David, we have received a distress signal from the Outer Rim. A human exploration ship has crashed on a desert world, and the crew is trapped with a group of silicon-based lifeforms who are dying from heat exposure. David felt the familiar pull of responsibility. How far away? 3 days' travel at maximum speed. The humans can probably survive the heat better than the silicon beings, David mused. But they'll need someone who understands how to share resources between species with different needs. Salth placed a scaled hand on David's shoulder. The Shield brother speaks as if he plans to leave us. Not leave, David corrected. Expand what we've learned here. Every species we help becomes part of this network of cooperation. Admiral Reef's bioluminescent markings pulsed with amusement. You cannot save the entire galaxy by yourself, friend David. No, David agreed. But I can save whoever needs saving right now, and maybe teach them to save others. The rescue mission that followed became another legend. David worked with volunteers from all three species to save both the human crew and the silicon-based creatures from the desert world. The solution involved creating underground cooling systems for the silicon beings, while the humans used their heat tolerance to gather resources on the surface. More importantly, it created another group of species who had learned that cooperation was stronger than competition. Over the following years, David became known throughout the galaxy as the Bridgewalker, the human who could move between any species and find common ground. But he never forgot that his greatest achievement wasn't saving individual lives, but creating the model that allowed different species to save each other. The colony of New Harmony grew into a major diplomatic center. The University of Interspecies Studies attracted students from dozens of worlds. The Joint Defense Fleet that protected the system included ships from 17 different species, all working together. David often returned to the original beach where he had first watched mixed-species children playing together. Now those children were adults, many of them serving as diplomats, scientists, and peacekeepers throughout the galaxy. Do you ever regret it? Ambassador Wong asked during one of her visits to the colony. She was older now, her hair gray but her eyes still sharp with curiosity. You could have had a quiet life back on Earth. Instead, you chose to carry the weight of interspecies relations on your shoulders. David considered the question, while watching a group of young adults from 6 different species working together to design a new water reclamation system. I think about the alternative sometimes. What would have happened if I had let those 14 Drakmari warriors die in the ice cavern? And the galaxy would be a much lonelier place. That evening, David swam out to the Deepwater Observatory where scientists from all three founding species studied the ocean currents that connected different parts of the planet. The water here was deep and dark, but David's enhanced biology allowed him to move through it as easily as walking on land. At the observatory, he found Dr. Sarah Kim working with Aguacate marine engineers and Drakmari thermal specialists on a new project. "We're designing current systems for the next colony world," she explained. "Thermal currents that will benefit warm-blooded species, chemical currents that support different metabolisms, and flow patterns that allow for both surface and deep water communities." David studied the holographic models of the proposed current systems. They looked like arteries carrying life throughout an entire world's oceans. Just like the colony itself, he realized. Different streams flowing together to create something larger. "Exactly," Dr. Kim agreed. "We've learned that diversity isn't just good for moral reasons. It's actually more efficient and more resilient than any single species system." David floated in the warm water, looking up through the transparent dome at the stars above. Somewhere out there, other species were learning the same lessons. Other individuals were making the choice to save someone different from themselves. Other communities were discovering that cooperation created strength rather than weakness. The current that had started with one human, refusing to let 14 warriors die in the cold, was now flowing throughout the galaxy. "Some currents run deeper than species," David said quietly, remembering the words he had spoken years ago during the first diplomatic crisis. "Some shields protect more than flesh, and some swimmers know that the deepest waters connect all shores." Above them, ships from a dozen different species moved through space in peaceful formation, their running lights creating patterns like constellations against the darkness. David smiled and dove deeper into the warm water, feeling the currents carry him toward whatever rescue mission would come next.